The first time Nick told me his car had broken down, I didn't think twice about it. Cars break all the time, especially his. It wasn't the newest model, and he was always complaining about how it sputtered when he turned the ignition. When he called that evening, saying he'd be late because the car had died on the way home, I simply asked if he needed me to pick him up. He declined, said he'd already called a tow truck, and I let it go. The second time, about 2 weeks later, I felt a twinge of suspicion. Another car issue? This time he claimed a flat tire had left him stranded on the side of the highway. Again, he assured me he had it under control. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just unlucky. But a little voice in the back of my mind whispered that something didn't add up. It was the third time that did it for me. A long evening, a dinner gone cold, and a text from Nick. "Sorry, babe. Car trouble again. Be home late." Something snapped inside me as I read those words. How could one car have so many problems in just a month? And why did it always seem to happen after work? I tried calling him. No answer. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. I didn't want to believe anything was wrong, but a knot in my stomach told me otherwise. So I did something I'd never done before. I got into my car and drove. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd see his car on the side of the road just like he said. I even started rehearsing my apology for doubting him. But when I passed the highways and main streets he'd usually take home, there was no sign of him, or his supposedly broken-down car. It wasn't until I pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of the Willow Creek Inn that my worst fears were confirmed. Nick's car, unmistakable with its dented front bumper and peeling sticker on the back window, was parked neatly in one of the spaces.
No tow truck.
No flat tire. Just his car sitting there like it belonged. For a moment I froze. My chest felt like it might cave in from the weight of realization. I wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation, but deep down I knew. This was no coincidence. The hotel was a notorious spot for rendezvous. I drove home in a daze, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. By the time I got to our driveway, my sadness had turned into something sharper. Anger. I wasn't going to confront him, not yet. No, I needed to be smart. I needed proof. The next day I woke up with a plan. If Nick wanted to use his car as an excuse, I'd give him a real reason to explain why it wasn't working. After he left for work, I grabbed my toolbox and headed to his car. I'd watched him fix little things before, so I knew enough to make a mess of his engine without doing any permanent damage. A few unplugged wires, a loosened battery terminal, and a strategically placed rock in the brake caliper would do the trick. It was enough to make the car unusable without alerting him that someone had tampered with it. Then I waited. That evening Nick walked through the door right on time. I tried not to show my surprise. "Hey," he said casually, dropping his bag by the door. "What's for dinner?" I played along, keeping my voice steady. "You're home early. No car trouble today." He hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "Nope. Smooth ride." My blood boiled at the lie, but I forced a smile and nodded. "That's great. You must have just had a string of bad luck." The real test came 2 days later. I made sure to park my car far away from the house so he'd have no choice but to rely on his. Sure enough, as he tried to leave for work that morning, I heard the sputtering and coughing of his engine struggling to start. I stood by the window, watching as he popped the hood and fiddled with the wires. "Damn it!" he shouted, slamming the hood shut. He came back inside, frustration etched on his face. "The car won't start." "Oh no," I said, feigning concern. "Maybe you should call a tow truck?" He looked at me, something flickering in his eyes. "Yeah, maybe." I could tell he was thinking, calculating. He knew he couldn't use the same excuse again without raising suspicion. So when he grabbed his phone and muttered something about calling a coworker for a ride, I pretended not to notice the nervous tremor in his voice. That evening I followed him. I stayed far enough behind to avoid being noticed, but close enough to see where he was going. My heart raced as he turned down the same road that led to the Willow Creek Inn. This time I parked out of sight and waited. Sure enough, he emerged from his coworker's car and headed straight for the entrance. I took a picture of him walking in, proof. My hand shook as I stared at the screen. There it was. The confirmation I dreaded but knew was coming. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I drove home and waited. When he walked through the door later that night, smelling faintly of cheap hotel soap, I stayed calm. I asked how his day was, if his coworker had been able to help him get to work, and he lied through his teeth like it was nothing. The next morning I handed him the photo. He stared at it, his face draining of color. Care to explain? I asked, my voice cold. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in years, Nick had nothing to say. And for the first time in years, I finally felt like I held the power. Nick's silence was deafening. A void that filled the room with tension so thick it was hard to breathe. He stared at the photo, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. I crossed my arms, waiting. For years I had trusted this man with everything. My heart, my dreams, my life. And now, here we were, standing in the wreckage of our marriage, with nothing but his guilt between us. Finally, he managed a weak, stammered excuse. It's not what it looks like, Jenna. I swear. I raised an eyebrow, the laugh that escaped my lips cold and bitter. Oh? Then please enlighten me. What does it look like, Nick? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been spending your evenings at a hotel instead of fixing your so-called broken car. He flinched as if my words physically struck him. It's work-related, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Work-related. I repeated, my voice rising. What kind of work takes you to a hotel, Nick? And don't even think about saying it's a conference. You don't even have a briefcase, let alone the kind of job that requires hotel stays. His face twisted, a mix of frustration and desperation. He looked like a man cornered, and for once I didn't feel sorry for him. I had spent too many nights wondering, worrying, doubting myself. Now the truth was staring me in the face, and I wasn't about to let him wriggle out of it. Fine, he snapped, throwing his hands in the air. You want the truth? Here it is, I've been meeting someone. But it's not what you think. My stomach churned, and for a moment I thought I might throw up. Not what I think. So you're telling me you're meeting someone at a hotel, lying to my face about car trouble, and it's not what I think? Are you even hearing yourself right now? He stepped closer, his voice pleading now. Jenna, please. Let me explain. I held up a hand, stopping him. No. You've had plenty of chances to explain, Nick. Every time you came home late. Every time you fed me some excuse about the car. I gave you the benefit of the doubt, and you threw it in my face. He looked at me, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. For a brief moment I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the man who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt and hold me when the world felt too heavy. But that man was a ghost now, replaced by a stranger who lied to me without hesitation. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I shook my head, my heart breaking all over again. You didn't mean for it to happen? Or you didn't mean for me to find out? He didn't answer, and his silence told me everything I needed to know. I turned away, tears streaming down my face, and walked out of the room. Behind me I heard him call my name, but I didn't stop. I went upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and locked it. For the first time in years I needed space, from him, from us, from everything. That night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the minutes turned into hours. My mind was a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal. I replayed every moment of our marriage, looking for signs I might have missed. Had he always been this way, or had something changed? Was it my fault? Was I not enough? The questions swirled unrelenting, until the first rays of dawn peeked through the curtains. When I finally emerged from the bedroom, Nick was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered the room, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. Jenna, he said softly, can we talk? I stared at him, my heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to throw him out of the house and never look back. But another part, the part that still remembered the love we once shared, wanted answers. Closure. Fine, I said, sitting down across from him. Talk. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. It's not just about her, he began. It's about us. I've been feeling lost, like we're just going through the motions, and I don't know how to fix it. I blinked, taken aback by his honesty. So your solution was to have an affair? He winced. No. That wasn't the solution. It was a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake. But Jenna, you have to understand. I never stopped loving you. I laughed bitterly. You have a funny way of showing it, Nick. I know, he said, his voice breaking. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to make things right. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I looked at him, searching his face for any sign of sincerity. Part of me wanted to believe him, to hold on to the hope that we could salvage what was left of our marriage. But another part, the part that had been hurt too many times, wasn't sure if I could ever trust him again. I don't know if that's possible, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. You broke something, Nick, and I don't know if it can be fixed. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. I understand, but please give me a chance to try. I stood up, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I need time, I said, my voice firm. Time to think. Time to figure out if I even want to try. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. As I walked away, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Not for us necessarily, but for myself. For the strength to rebuild with or without him. The days that followed were a blur of quiet conversations and uneasy silences. Nick tried to stay out of my way, as though he feared one wrong move might shatter whatever fragile thread was keeping me from walking out the door for good. I couldn't blame him for being cautious. Every glance, every word felt like it carried the weight of years of betrayal, disappointment, and broken trust. I wasn't ready to forgive, and honestly, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to. Work became my escape. I threw myself into every task, volunteered for extra hours, and stayed late at the office whenever I could. Anything to avoid coming home to the tension that had settled over our house like a heavy fog. My coworkers must have noticed the change in me, but no one asked questions. I appreciated their silence. It gave me space to think without having to explain myself to anyone. At night, though, there was no escaping my thoughts. I would lie awake in the dark, the glow of the streetlight outside casting faint patterns on the ceiling, and replay every moment of our relationship. The way Nick used to hold my hand on long drives. The time he stayed up all night with me when I was sick, even though he had an important meeting the next day. The way he used to make me laugh so hard my stomach hurt. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a different version of us that I couldn't quite recognize anymore. One evening, I found myself parked outside the Willow Creek Inn. I hadn't meant to come here, but somehow my car had brought me to the place where everything had unraveled. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a garish red glow over the parking lot. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what I was looking for. Closure, maybe, or some kind of clarity. But all I felt was anger. Anger at Nick, at the woman he had been meeting, and at myself for letting it happen. The thought struck me suddenly. Who was she? I didn't even know her name, let alone what she looked like. Nick hadn't offered any details, and I hadn't asked. Part of me wondered if knowing would make it worse, if putting a face to the betrayal would make it harder to move on. But another part of me, a darker, angrier part, wanted answers. I wanted to know who she was, why she had been worth risking everything we'd built together. When I got home that night, Nick was in the kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey. He looked up when I walked in, his expression wary. Hey, he said cautiously. How was work? Fine, I replied curtly, brushing past him. I could feel his eyes on me as I climbed the stairs, but he didn't follow. That was his new pattern. He gave me space, waited for me to make the first move. It was almost laughable, the way he tiptoed around me now, as though he thought being careful would erase the damage he'd already done. Upstairs, I opened my laptop and began to dig. It didn't take long to find her. A few searches on social media, a bit of cross-referencing, and there she was, Melissa Carter. Her profile was public, and her photos told me everything I needed to know. She was younger than me, with long blonde hair and a smile that seemed to radiate confidence. Her posts were full of glamorous outings, trendy cocktails, and inspirational quotes about living your best life. She didn't look like someone who would care about wrecking a marriage. She looked like someone who thrived on attention, someone who always got what she wanted. I stared at her photos until my vision blurred, my chest tightening with a mix of rage and insecurity. Was this who Nick had chosen over me? A woman who probably spent more time picking out her Instagram filters than thinking about the consequences of her actions? I wanted to scream, to throw something, to lash out at the universe for being so cruel. But instead I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark, tears streaming silently down my face. The next morning I confronted Nick. He was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through his phone, when I dropped the laptop in front of him, the screen still open to Melissa's profile. His face paled as he realized what I had found. "Jenna," he began, his voice trembling. I snapped, cutting him off. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I just want to know one thing, why? What did she have that I didn't?" He stared at the screen, his hands trembling slightly. "It wasn't about her," he said finally. "It was about me. I don't know. I felt like I was losing myself, like I wasn't enough anymore. And she made me feel wanted." "Wanted?" I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. "You had me, Nick. I wanted you. I loved you. But apparently that wasn't enough." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm begging you, Jenna. Don't give up on us." I stood there, my heart aching with a pain I didn't think was possible. Part of me wanted to believe him, to cling to the hope that we could somehow rebuild what we had lost. But another part of me, the part that had been broken too many times, wasn't sure if I had anything left to give. "I don't know if I can do this," I said quietly. "I need time, Nick. Time to figure out if I even want to try." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Take all the time you need," he said. "Just, please don't shut me out completely." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked away, my mind racing with a million unanswered questions. For now, time was all I could offer. Whether it would heal or break us, only time would tell. The days stretched on, each one more suffocating than the last. Nick gave me space, just as I'd asked, but the silence between us was oppressive. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of trust, of connection, of the life we had once shared. I found myself avoiding him as much as possible, retreating into my own world where I didn't have to face the weight of his guilt or the shadow of my own pain. At work, I buried myself in tasks, desperate for anything to keep my mind occupied. My coworkers started to notice, their concerned glances lingering a little too long, but I brushed them off with practiced smiles and vague assurances. The truth was, I didn't know how to talk about what I was going through. How do you explain the slow unraveling of your marriage? How do you put into words the feeling of being replaced, of being not enough? One evening, as I was leaving the office, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, a sinking feeling in my stomach even before I read the words. It was her. "Melissa, I think we should talk," the message read. "It's not fair to either of us to leave things like this." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to block her number and pretend she didn't exist. But another part of me, the part that needed answers, couldn't let it go. Against my better judgment, I typed out a response. "What do you want?" Her reply came almost instantly. "I just want to explain. Can we meet? Tomorrow 6 p.m. at the coffee shop on Elm Street." I didn't respond right away. I spent the entire drive home debating whether or not to go. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I still hadn't made up my mind. But as I sat there in the car, staring at the dimly lit windows of our house, I realized that I needed this. I needed to hear her side, to understand why she had inserted herself into my life and torn it apart. The next evening, I arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes early. My hands were clammy, my chest tight with nerves. I scanned the room looking for her, and when I saw her sitting at a table near the window, my stomach twisted into knots. She looked exactly like her photos, blonde, polished, exuding an effortless confidence that made me feel small and unremarkable by comparison. She looked up as I approached, her expression unreadable. "Jenna," she said, standing and extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." I ignored the hand and sat down across from her. "Let's get this over with," I said coldly. She nodded, her smile faltering. "Fair enough." She took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her coffee cup. "First, I want to say that I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." I let out a bitter laugh. "You never meant to hurt me? You slept with my husband. What did you think was going to happen?" Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "You're right. I was selfish and I wasn't thinking about anyone but myself. But I need you to know that I didn't go into this with the intention of breaking up your marriage. Then why? I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. Why go after a married man? What could you possibly gain from that? She hesitated, her eyes dropping to her lap. I didn't know he was married at first, she admitted. He didn't tell me. By the time I found out, I was already involved. And then he told me things about your relationship that made me think. Stop, I said, holding up a hand. Don't you dare try to blame this on me. Whatever problems Nick and I had, they were ours to deal with, not yours. I know, she said quickly. I'm not trying to make excuses. I thought you deserved to know the truth. He told me he was unhappy that you two were more like roommates than a couple. I believed him, and I let myself think it was okay to keep seeing him. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. The idea of Nick sharing our private struggles with her, of him painting me as some cold, distant partner, was almost more painful than the affair itself. And did you think you'd fix him? I asked, my voice laced with sarcasm. That you'd swoop in and make everything better? Her expression hardened. I'm not proud of what I did, Jenna. But I'm not the only one at fault here. Nick made his choices too. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're right. He did. And so did you. And now you both get to live with the consequences. I walked out of the coffee shop, my heart pounding and my hands shaking. The conversation had done nothing to bring me closure. It had only reopened wounds I was struggling to heal. As I got into my car, I realized that no amount of apologies or explanations would ever erase what had happened. The damage was done, and it was up to me to decide where to go from here. When I got home, Nick was waiting for me. He looked up as I walked through the door, his face filled with worry. Where were you? He asked softly. Talking to her, I said, dropping my bag on the floor. His eyes widened and I saw panic flicker across his face. Jenna, Don't, I interrupted. I don't want to hear it. Not tonight. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. As I walked past him and headed upstairs, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of his betrayal. Whether I stayed or left, it was time to reclaim my life. For me, the following weeks became an endless loop of uncertainty, a tightrope I was walking between leaving and staying. I hadn't made a final decision yet, but every interaction with Nick felt like another chip being taken out of the foundation of what little remained of our marriage. He was trying in his own way. He started coming home earlier, cooking dinner sometimes, even leaving little notes on the counter before he left for work. Things like, "Hope your day goes well," or "Thinking of you." But those notes didn't erase the betrayal. They didn't undo the lies, the nights I'd spent alone wondering where he was while he was with her. Every kind gesture felt like a band-aid slapped over a wound too deep to heal that easily. And I couldn't stop questioning his motives. Was he truly remorseful, or was he just terrified of losing the comfort of our life together? Of losing me, the stability I provided while he ran off chasing whatever it was he had been chasing with her. One night I sat at the dining room table long after dinner, the untouched plate of food in front of me growing cold. Nick was upstairs, giving me space as he always did now, and I found myself scrolling through my phone aimlessly. My finger hovered over the contact for my best friend Hannah. I hadn't told her about any of this yet. I didn't know why. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was the fear of hearing her say what I already knew deep down, that this was unforgivable and that I deserved better. Finally I hit call. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered, warm and cheerful as always. Jenna. Hey, it's been a while. What's up? I hesitated, my throat tightening. Hannah, I said quietly, my voice trembling. I need to talk to you. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then her tone shifted, instantly serious. What's wrong? Are you okay? No, I admitted, tears spilling down my cheeks. I'm not okay. An hour later, Hannah was sitting across from me in my living room, her hand clasped over mine as I poured out everything. The lies, the affair, the confrontation with Melissa. I didn't hold anything back, letting all the pain and anger I'd been bottling up spill out in a flood of words. By the time I finished, I was emotionally drained, my face wet with tears. Hannah sat quietly, her expression a mix of sadness and anger. "Jenna," she said finally, her voice firm but kind, "you don't have to put up with this. You don't owe him anything." "I know," I whispered. "But it's not that simple. We've been together for so long. I don't even know who I am without him." "You're you," she said fiercely. "You're strong, kind, and way too good for someone who would treat you like this. Don't let him make you forget that." Her words hit me like a bolt of lightning, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of clarity. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was more than just Nick's wife, more than the shattered pieces of this broken marriage. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for him to fix things and start taking control of my own life. The next day I called a therapist. I hadn't been to therapy in years, not since my college days, but I knew I needed help sorting through the mess of emotions swirling inside me. The therapist, Dr. Harper, was calm and understanding, and she didn't push me to make any decisions I wasn't ready for. Instead, she helped me focus on myself, my needs, my boundaries, my future. Through those sessions, I started to see things more clearly. I realized that I had been pouring so much of myself into trying to fix our marriage that I had forgotten how to take care of me. I started going to the gym again, something I used to love but had let fall by the wayside. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, just for the joy of creating something with my hands. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to feel like myself again. Nick noticed the change. At first, he seemed hopeful, like he thought my newfound sense of independence was a sign that things were getting better between us. But as the weeks went on, he started to realize that I wasn't just finding myself. I was also finding the strength to question whether I even wanted to stay in this marriage. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, Nick finally broke the silence. "Jenna," he said quietly, "I feel like I'm losing you." I looked up from my plate, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like days. "Nick," I said, my voice calm but firm, "you already lost me. The night you lied to me about your car, the night I found out about Melissa, you lost me then. And I don't know if I can come back from that." His face crumpled, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt. But I pushed it aside. This wasn't about sparing his feelings. This was about being honest for once. "I know I messed up," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve you. But I'm begging you, Jenna. Don't give up on us." I sighed, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "I'm not giving up, Nick. I'm choosing myself. I've spent so much time trying to make this work, trying to fix something you broke, and I can't do it anymore. I need to figure out what I want, who I want to be. And I don't think I can do that while I'm still here." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Nick looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "So what does that mean?" "It means I'm leaving," I said softly. "Not forever. Maybe not even for long. But I need space. I need time." He nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "I'll wait," he said. "As long as it takes. I'll wait for you." I didn't respond. I didn't know if there would be anything to wait for. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, I was finally putting myself first. And as I packed my bags that night, a strange sense of peace washed over me. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. My beginning. When I closed the door behind me that night, the weight of it all hit me like a tidal wave. My suitcase rolled unevenly behind me as I walked to the car, its wheels catching on every crack in the pavement, a small but persistent annoyance that seemed to mirror the chaos in my mind. I stopped at the driver's side door and looked back at the house, our house. The porch light flickered slightly, casting a dim glow over the steps where we'd once sat together, talking late into the night about our future, our dreams, the family we thought we'd have someday. Now it felt like a stranger's home, and I was the intruder. Nick hadn't come to the door to watch me leave. Maybe he thought it would hurt less for both of us if he didn't. Or maybe he couldn't bear to see the finality of it, to watch me drive away with the life we'd built packed neatly into a suitcase. Either way, the house stood still and silent, and I knew this was the right decision, even if it was tearing me apart. The car ride was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. Didn't want the distraction of someone else's words filling the silence. I needed to process everything. My mind wandered back to the night I'd found his car in that hotel parking lot. The moment felt distant now, like it had happened to someone else, another version of me who was still so desperate to believe in him. I wasn't that woman anymore. I couldn't be. I pulled into the driveway of Hannah's house and parked. She had insisted I stay with her, brushing off my protests with her usual no-nonsense attitude. "You're not going to some motel like you're running away from home," she'd said when I called her earlier. "You're coming here, where I can keep an eye on you and make sure you're not living off granola bars and vending machine coffee." She was waiting for me at the door, her arms crossed but her face soft with concern. "Took you long enough," she said as I approached, trying to lighten the mood. "I was starting to think you got cold feet." I gave her a weak smile. "No cold feet," I said. "Just a lot on my mind." She nodded and stepped aside to let me in. "Come on. I made tea. Or if you're feeling brave, there's wine. Your call." "Wine," I said immediately, earning a laugh from her as she closed the door behind us. She led me into the kitchen, where 2 glasses of red wine were already poured and waiting on the counter. I picked one up and took a long sip, savoring the warmth as it spread through my chest. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Hannah didn't push me to talk, and I was grateful for that. We sat at the kitchen table, sipping our wine in comfortable silence until I finally broke it. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, staring into my glass. "I thought leaving would make me feel stronger, but now I just feel lost." "That's normal," she said gently. "You've been in survival mode for so long, Jenna. It's going to take time to figure out who you are outside of all this. But you will figure it out. I know you will." Her confidence in me was a bomb, even if I didn't fully share it yet. We talked for a while longer about everything and nothing, until the wine was gone and exhaustion finally caught up with me. Hannah showed me to the guest room, where she'd already set out fresh sheets and a towel for the morning. "Get some rest," she said as she hugged me goodnight. "Tomorrow's a new day." The guest room was small but cozy, with soft lighting and a quilt that reminded me of the one my grandmother used to have. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the neatly folded towel on the nightstand. For a moment I felt a pang of guilt. Hannah had gone out of her way to make me feel at home. And here I was invading her space with my mess of a life. But as I lay down and pulled the quilt over me, the weight of the day finally began to lift. I wasn't alone in this. I had people who cared about me, who wanted to see me whole again. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Hannah humming to herself in the kitchen. I got up and joined her, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. She handed me a mug of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, her way of saying she wasn't going to let me wallow in self-pity. "So," she said as we sat down to eat, "what's the plan?" I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Leaving Nick had been as much about escaping the present as it had been about finding clarity. Now that I was here with no immediate crisis to distract me, I realized I didn't know what came next. "I guess I need to figure out what I want," I said slowly. "Not just with Nick, but with my life. I don't even know who I am anymore." "Then start there," she said simply. "Figure out what makes you happy, what makes you feel alive. And don't worry about the rest for now. It'll fall into place." Her words stayed with me throughout the day as I ran errands, went for a walk, and even stopped by a local bookstore to browse for something to read. I found myself drawn to a shelf of travel books, the glossy photos of faraway places sparking a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity, adventure, possibility. I bought one of the books on a whim, a guide to solo travel that promised to help me rediscover yourself while exploring the world. It felt like a sign, a reminder that there was more to life than the small broken world I had been living in. That night, as I flipped through the pages, I felt the beginnings of hope stirring in my chest. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. Maybe it was just the beginning of something new, something I hadn't even dared to dream of yet. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that I could be happy again. The idea of solo travel took root in my mind over the following days, growing from a fleeting notion into something more tangible. It wasn't just about getting away from Nick or escaping the weight of my emotions. It was about finding myself in a way I hadn't allowed for years. Life with Nick had been comfortable at first, but somewhere along the line I'd stopped dreaming, stopped imagining anything beyond the neat little bubble we'd built together. That bubble had burst, and now I was staring at the endless possibilities of what could come next. I started small, researching destinations online late at night when the house was quiet and my thoughts were loud. Europe called to me: the cobblestone streets of Paris, the rolling hills of Tuscany, the ancient ruins of Greece. Each image I found sparked something inside me, a yearning I couldn't ignore. But the idea of packing a bag and stepping onto a plane alone still felt overwhelming, like a leap too far into the unknown. So I decided to ease into it. A weekend trip, something manageable but far enough from home to feel like a fresh start. Hannah was thrilled when I told her about my plan. "You need this," she said, beaming at me over coffee one morning. "And honestly, I'm jealous. If I didn't have a million responsibilities, I'd be booking a ticket to join you." Her encouragement was the push I needed. That evening, I booked a cabin in the Smoky Mountains, just a few hours' drive away. It was nothing fancy, rustic, quiet, and surrounded by nature. Exactly what I needed. When I hit the confirm reservation button, a strange mix of excitement and anxiety washed over me. This was it. My first step towards something new. The day I left for the cabin, I packed light. A small suitcase, my new travel book, and a notebook I hadn't touched in years. Writing had once been my passion, a way to process my thoughts and feelings, but somewhere along the line, I'd let it slip away. Now I felt drawn to it again, as though putting my emotions into words might help me make sense of them. I didn't know what I would write, only that I needed to start. The drive to the cabin was beautiful. The sun filtered through the trees lining the highway, casting dappled patterns of light on the road. The further I got from home, the lighter I felt, as if I were shedding layers of sadness and doubt with every mile. When I finally arrived, the sight of the cabin took my breath away.